to come back, you can take that home, and I'd invite you to bring it with you. We've only made so many copies, but I think the talk will make more sense and be a little easier to see the shape of things, to refer to the various lyrics and hymns and things like that. So if you're taking it with you, please bring it back. If you are not planning to return this afternoon, please just give it back to me before we leave this morning. Okay? So again, we'll start in just a minute once everybody has a chance to be here. All right, everybody. I think this is us for now. Thanks for finding us here in the chapel. I'd like to say there was a good reason for being in here, but really I just miss being in this space and like teaching in this space and feel like if we're going to talk about music, we might as well be in a space where we make music on a regular basis. Next week, when we're talking about art, we've got a docent from the Ackland coming, Nick Carter, a former dean of Andover Newton Theological Seminary. So he will be with us. He's going to be in the parish hall because he'll be using the audiovisual things to show us pictures and stuff. And then the following week, the last series in this series, we'll have our annual poetry reading, which will be back in here. And those of you who've come to that before, great. If you haven't, please come because it'll be a lot of fun. Yes, Martha. Good. Martha is saying that putting an extra plug in for Nick Carter next week, who will be with us. Superb docent, I'm sure a wonderful pastor as well, and from our email exchanges, a rather funny guy. So I think we'll enjoy being with him. But for today, you're stuck with me, and we're going to be talking about Advent, particularly Advent music. Come on in, Sarah. We're going to be talking about Advent music. There's something about this season, right, of Advent and Christmas where the music becomes particularly important. And I think we can all agree that it's really perhaps the best part of this season. The songs we get to sing, the hymns, the carols, the anthems, all of which come fast and furious this time of year. So if you're like us in our house, you've already started listening to the carol compilations on your CDs, or you've got a Spotify playlist, or you're listening to WCPE in the morning, and they're getting in on the act as well. So there's all sorts of opportunities for this, and I think on the one hand, the reason for this is the tradition, right? We are used to singing and hearing music at this time of year, and it's a great gift. We have memories of growing up and either coming to church or sitting around the fire or around the Christmas tree, and this sort of calls that for us. Hey, Hugh, hey, Vince, I've got something for you guys here. But I think there's more to it than that. I think there's actually perhaps a more theological reason that music is so important this time of year to us, and that is because we are in this season where we are preparing for, where we are celebrating the incarnation, right? This idea of God becoming flesh. God entering the world in this child, in Jesus, and then going on and doing some pretty incredible things. There is a really incarnational aspect of music, right? This sense of spirit, of sound, of motion, of the physics tell us there are waves out there that then sort of come to rest in us. We either produce them or we hear them, and something really brings us in tune with that movement, with that energy, with that spirit, which is literally sort of breath taking on flesh. So for me, the music is not superfluous to this season. It actually is essential to celebrating the incarnational component, especially singing, where we take in breath and use our flesh, the two little vocal cords that are in our throat, to rub them together and produce something that is glorious. Usually. Maybe. Sometimes. Now, Advent music and Christmas music they have different feels to them. Some people are already into Christmas music. We are very much intentional about keeping ourselves in the Advent season. And Advent is not necessarily a celebratory season. It's different in style. And it's teaching us these disciplines of patience and hope. And these are disciplines, these are virtues that you need to sort of let sit, let germinate a little bit before they can actually flower and burst forth. So it's a time of a little bit less exuberance, a little bit more solemn, a little bit more quiet. And Advent is not only about waiting for Christmas, but it actually, as we are seeing in these first couple weeks, is as much, if not more, about the second coming of Christ. And the reason we look back to the first coming of Christ is because we need some food for the journey, something to nourish our hope and our expectation. We're not exactly looking forward to Jesus being born in the stable again. We are using that to cast our vision forward. And the promise is at the end of the story that Jesus was a central component of, that will involve an even fuller coming together of God and creation, of incarnation. Heaven and earth, spirit and flesh, come together in one. That is what we are waiting for. That is what we are looking towards in Advent. So Advent has a little more serious, a little more weight, a little more solemn, perhaps even somber. It certainly is intense, right? And this is all preparation for the joys of Christmas to break forth, but they in and of themselves are not the end of the story. They are not the fulfillment of the promise. They're a fulfillment of a promise, but the promise has an end that is heretofore yet unseen. And it's on us in Advent to sort of clean up the house before the party, right? In this time of season, in this season, perhaps, maybe you're getting back to hosting people for events, for dinners. The most furious, stressful, difficult time is the sort of 45 minutes before everybody arrives. Am I wrong? Right? They're sort of rushing around, scurrying around the house, throwing things into the closet. That's sort of Advent, right? Because the guests are coming. They're on the way. And here we are trying to get ready, trying to set everything up. It almost makes you think, why am I doing this? Oh, I shouldn't have people over. It's too much. And then they come, you have a wonderful time, and you think, oh, we should do this more often, right? Now, Christmas then is the party season. That's the dinner party. The promise of Jesus' coming has been fulfilled. The thing has happened. Let us rejoice and sing. And there's a different tone then to the music. That will not be my focus here. We're going to focus on Advent for the moment. But you will be able to tell and sense the slightly different nature, the tone, literally and figuratively, of the music if you come to our 2 Lessons and Carols services. Now, Lessons and Carols today at 4 p.m. and on Christmas Eve at 7 p.m. will be Christmas Lessons and Carols. Today, Advent Lessons and Carols, because it's really no secret. Someone finally figured out that the stories and the music are the best parts of this season. So they said, let's cut out all the other stuff and just use the good stuff, right? And these were created to highlight those things, the lessons and the carols, the music, the hymns. So we're going to dive into this service that's coming for this afternoon and talk about the readings and the musical selections. Now, this liturgy, which you have in your hand, is a little different in order and structure than we've done in the past. So that's why part of the reason I want to do this, also because I think it bears some fruit. Some of you don't have it because I have run out of copies. If there are those who are willing to share, pass back a little bit. Thank you, guys. Vince, you want one there? Want a copy of this? Oh, you got... Okay, good. Thank you, Jamie. Excellent. Taking care of one another here. All right, so we're going to be looking through this, and I want to talk you through the structure, the form, but also the content. So we're going to be looking at how it is constructed as a whole and why, and then also some of the content of both the readings and the carols. Now, in short, to summarize here, we're going to start by looking even further back than the prophecies of Jesus' birth, of the Messiah, all the way back to the beginning of creation, when God creates light. Then we'll move to the more immediate prophecies of Jesus' birth, and then it will jump the birth itself, because it's not quite Christmas, and show us how the first Advent prefigures the second Advent in linking up with the preparation we are commanded to observe in getting ready for Christ's birth, mirrors the preparation in getting ready for Christ's return. I think it's helpful to think of this in more of a circle than a line. It doesn't make a lot of sense if we sort of start, we're looking back and then we're looking back again. But if you think of this as something that's coming around, the beginning and the end are actually going to be quite close to each other on a circle. And again, we'll pick up these themes as we go and talk about how that makes a little bit more sense. So let's begin with the Voluntaries. We begin with 2 organ preludes that will set the tone, literally, with seasonal appropriate organ music when you're coming in to be seated. We've got a piece by Bach and a piece by Brahms, 2 very famous composers. The Bach will be the Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, Savior of the Nations Come, which we just sang as our closing hymn for those who were in church at 9 o'clock. This is a Lutheran chorale. The text is literally by Martin Luther, but it's based on the writings of the 4th century bishop, Bishop Ambrose. Now, Bach wrote this organ piece, which is one of his most famous, around 1748, but it itself is based on a hymn tune from 1524. So Bach, a lot of times, took established tunes, established sort of melodies, and then did his Bach thing and made them sort of famous and extrapolated from them, set harmonies to them, rearranged them slightly. This is not the only time we'll see this. We'll see this a little bit later on as well. So that is just something to be in mind, and if you can come a few minutes early and be here for the prelude, that's what's happening. There's no words, obviously, but the tune that he's using and then, sort of extrapolating from is this hymn, Savior of the Nations Come. Likewise, Brahms, the second organ voluntary, is the piece Es ist ein Ros, right? That's Lo, how a rose. But again, you may know that hymn tune and carol, a glorious one, a wonderful one, but Brahms has taken it and he's using an organ piece inspired by it, so there is no text associated with it, it's just sort of set as the title. Now, this German text, which we won't be singing this afternoon, was first appeared in the 15th century. So it's been around for a few hundred years. Brahms didn't write this until 1896. It's part of a set of 11 chorale preludes. And they actually weren't published until 1902, which was after Brahms' death. So these are late in life compositions for him. Those are just some nuggets of information for you as you think about these and hear and prepare yourself in worship by listening to these voluntaries. But they've been chosen on purpose. We then move into something called the Advent Responsory, which is sort of like the preface to a book, right, or the opening credits of a movie. It is participating within the work of the liturgy, but also standing somewhat outside of it. And there are some interesting things that can be done in that sort of liminal artistic space, right at the threshold. And this will literally be sung at the threshold. The way we have been doing the past couple weeks with the choir starting from the back of the church, they will sing this responsory from back there. Now the text is based, and the music is based on a work by Palestrina, who's a famous 16th century Italian composer, considered by many to be sort of the pinnacle of Renaissance polyphony, which, if you're familiar with the genre, involves a lot of counterpoint and polyphonic singing, a sort of back and forth between the voices, a weaving together of the different vocal lines to create this sort of cloud of sound. So you get a little bit of that, but you'll actually hear at the beginning and throughout a sort of a solo plain song that sort of sets out the first line, that it then blossoms into the choral response. I look from afar. And then everybody comes in and they do some interesting things with it, and then it stops. And then there's another solo voice, and then they do some interesting things, and then it stops. Now, this particular arrangement, it's perhaps probably the most well-known now, was adapted by a Palestrina Magnificat. So we'll talk about the Magnificat in a few minutes. But Palestrina wrote a version of that, and then Stephen Cleobury, the longtime director of King's College, Cambridge, and their choir, he fashioned it in a way for this Advent lessons and carols service that they did, which now has been populated, or has been made popular throughout the world, really. So for many people, this is a very familiar opening to the Advent lessons and carols, and for many, the Advent season. I worked for a priest who said, "Until I hear the Palestrina responses, it is not Advent," which made things difficult when we had it on like the second Sunday of Advent, for example. But he managed. The text that we're using is actually from a medieval Roman liturgy. So the Roman Catholic Church, a medieval liturgy, and it speaks to this second coming, right? Even though there are echoes of this first coming. I look from afar, and lo, I see the power of God coming, and a cloud covering the whole earth. Now, to add to the drama of this prophecy, if you will, the choir is standing in the back. It's sort of like they're standing off stage. And so this sense of I look from afar has not quite come yet, right? The sound is at a distance. We're going to have the lights turned down or off. And we sit in darkness then, waiting for that light and hearing the voices calling forth for that future that has not yet dawned. Kind of, again, like the opening credit sequence. It sets the tone for the whole event, but is not quite of the story itself. Now, we're going to pick up that idea of the darkness and the light. And this is where things are a little different, or not only place, but one of the major places there's a difference in this liturgy, which is we're going to jump to Genesis. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created, the earth was darkness, and there was sort of a formless void, and out of that, God says, "Let there be light." So we've just heard about the second coming from these, hopefully, angelic voices off stage. And we sit in darkness awaiting that, but then we are brought all the way back to the beginning to hear not the story of Christmas, but the story of creation, right? You may be thinking, Genesis in Advent? That seems a little out of place. But in very much, in this sense of a time when we are calling the light of Christ coming forth in the world, it does make a certain amount of poetic sense to talk about the light first being created in the world. And because we recall that first act of creation, it spools out into this next act of creation or incarnation, which, to paraphrase St. John in his gospel, the light comes into the world, and the darkness could not overcome it. What this also does is situates Advent and Christmas in a somewhat more cosmic drama than perhaps we think of them in when we are just thinking about the stable and Bethlehem and all that. It conjures this primordial theme of light and dark. In the birth of this baby, we are dealing with something really big, like a star being born, which, not coincidentally, shows up, right, in the birth narrative and is followed by the Magi. And so don't be surprised, I think the message is here, by the bigness of this second coming, which we talk about, which could seem a little bit off-putting to us, right? Because it did happen, it can happen. That's the argument. And as a way of embodying that, we will each be getting a candle this evening, and we will start in darkness, and as we move forward, we will spread those candles from person to person, and the light will slowly come into our space to embody this coming into the world of the light of Christ, of the light, and then the light of Christ, separating those out but connecting them. And to emphasize that, we will finish this reading and move into, and no one's come down the aisle yet, everybody's still staying in place. We will then begin the procession, and the choir will chant and sing, "Creator of the stars of night." Right? This light in darkness, this first act of creation that is distilled into this birth that we are so eagerly expecting, that will be our procession forward into the space as the candles are shared and as the light begins to grow. Creator of the stars of night, your people's everlasting light, O Christ, Redeemer of us all, we pray you hear us when we call. When this old world drew on toward night, you came, but not in splendor bright, not as a monarch, but the child of Mary, blameless, mother mild. The tune is a Latin plain song from the 9th century, if not earlier. I say the text is from the 9th century, if not earlier. The tune is a little bit later, but still medieval. It's long been associated for, something over 1,000 years now, this particular chant. And if you've heard it, or if you're hearing it in your ear, it goes, Creator of the stars of night, thy people's everlasting light, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's this still ethereal, beautiful, little bit haunting chant that to me is only added in significance based upon how long it has been in people's ears as they prayed in this season. And it is picking up on this theme of Christ as the one through whom all things were made. Again, St. John's Gospel, if you go back to it, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. All things came into being through him, and not one thing that was created was made without him. That's what's going on here. And that's where we're going back to start from. The text is directed to Jesus, but it's talking about creation. Christ was present then present again at the incarnation, and then again, that second coming to which we look forward. So you've all been very good about listening to this point, hopefully. And then we will move ourselves into actually singing. The congregation will get up and get moving here. And we are still on this same theme of light and dark and early creation, of incarnation connected to creation. And we will stand and sing the hymn, Of the Father's Heart Begotten. There's a couple of different translations of this, so we've selected one that's going to be printed in the bulletin for you to do. But again, this continues on the cosmic weight of Christ's coming, right? Oh, I don't have it with me here. But of the Father's heart begotten, ere the world from chaos rose, right? He is Alpha, from that fountain all that is and hath been flows. He is Omega, we've got Alpha, we've got Omega. Of all things yet to come the mystic close, evermore and evermore. So there we are, right? The beginning and the end being brought together. We're talking about Christ in relationship to that first act of creation. Now the tune is called Divinum Mysterium. It's a trope melody, which is essentially an embellished chant, probably from around the 13th century. There's much discrepancy and debate around the exact rhythm, actually, so it's somewhat of an editor's choice. We will sing what has become the traditional tune, which is in 3, right? Of the Father's love begotten. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. That's how we're going to do it when we sing it here. There are other people who sing it straight. They won't have the 1, 2, 3. It'll just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It loses a little bit of its swing, right? You want to get a little swing in your church. Now the text for this is from the 4th century. Again, 4th century. Written by Prudentius, who was an early Roman Christian poet. He would have had to have been for the 4th century, very early. And he was writing just as Christianity was coming out of the shadows. And during a time which Orthodox Christianity was very much up for debate. What is it exactly we believe about all these strange happenings? And this hymn, while beautiful poetry, was also, in a sense, a defense of the faith. And so it's a masterful poetic work, but also an act of theology, an act of apologetics, an argument for the faith. So as you look through it, think of it like that. And I'll just say again, I love how our music and our tradition can transport us literally hundreds, thousands of years, and we take in words and music into ourselves that have been taken in and used by those who have been practicing this faith for thousands of years. Right? That great cloud of witnesses we so often talk about, we are singing words they sung. Now we're singing in English and they were singing in a different language. We're singing tunes also that people have sung for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that to me is sort of gives you a little bit of a sense of the bigness of what it is we're about here. And again, positioning the incarnation in direct relationship with creation in this text, they are drawn from the same source, right, of the Father's heart. And they mark the beginning point and the end point of all things, the Alpha and the Omega. So that's our whole opening section, if you will, and that sort of concludes this section where we're focused on creation. It draws the important connections between the beginning and the end and positions the birth of Christ actually in between those things. Not as a separate event, but as a sort of important checkpoint along the way. And it also plays up these themes of light and dark, which we will dramatically bring into the space ourselves. So, creation, incarnation, second coming, all in a line, all, perhaps better said, in a circle of God's activity. We'll then move into the opening prayer, the bidding prayer, and the Lord's Prayer, and this serves as a transition for us. I'm not going to look at those closely, but you're welcome to. It serves as a transition between the focus on creation to the focus on that more specific prophecy, the specific promise of Jesus' birth, the coming of the Messiah. You can think of it a little bit like an hourglass shape. You've got this big idea of the cosmic ideas of light and dark distilled into this one moment in history, this time of God's inbreaking into the world, and then we will, in a few minutes, widen back out into that sense of the second coming, the full coming of God among us. So we hear now slightly more familiar stories. The promise of the Messiah coming from Isaiah. We hear Gabriel talking to Mary, and then we hear John the Baptist. And the question here becomes, what exactly are we looking forward to in the birth here? We'll be in Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 9, and we hear about the shoot, the branch coming from the stump of Jesse. Jesse being the father of David, right? So this Davidic line, the analogy, the metaphor here is of a plant that has been cut down. And yet, from this stump comes forth new life, a continuation of life, not wholly new, but coming from the old. Stump, which is worth sort of dwelling on here, something to stumble over, to step on, but not in mire. And from that seemingly meaningless, dead piece of wood, there comes this tenderest and most vulnerable but hopeful expression of new life. Just a shoot, just a baby, right? Not thunder and lightning from on high, but the smallest yet most incredible, most important coming up of life from below. Yeah? And by the grace and the Spirit of the Lord, he will be given then much power and much wisdom to accomplish great things. That's the first part of Isaiah's reading. The next part talks about the kingdom, right? The kingdom that he will usher in. The reign that this little one will have will be in complete defiance of the natural order that we have come to expect, right? This is where you hear the lion and the lamb, the wolf and the sheep, the bear and the ox, and the kid will play with his hand over the snake's hole. Because in nature itself, there will be no more violence or division or destruction. That whole impulse will be gone. Which I just think is a wonderful way of trying to encapsulate just how transformative this kingdom will be. Predator and prey will not exist as categories anymore. They will simply be neighbors. That is what life will be like when the earth shall be filled with the glory of God. That's what Isaiah is talking about. That's what gets named somewhat condescendingly as the peaceable kingdom. Right? That's what it is. So from that glorious vision of the peaceable kingdom, we get a glorious carol, which is, "There is no rose of such virtue," which revels in this feeling of adoration and of hope. It's a 15th century English text, so from England, hasn't been translated, well, has been updated, but not translated. And it's a hymn of praise to Mary. who herself sort of bears this new branch, this shoot. This rose, Mary then, the rose of such virtue, who bare Jesu, right? But interspersed in this little trio, so it's going to be an unaccompanied a cappella trio, which is, we believe, how it was originally heard some 600 years ago. So you'll be transported again back in time to a different time and place, and yet a similar message. Interspersed with this little trio, there are these Latin exclamations. Alleluia, praise be to God. Res miranda, wonderful thing. Pari forma, equal in form. Gaudeamus, let us rejoice. Transiamus, let us follow. Right? Here, can you hear there's sort of some theological argument happening in here, right? A little bit of like, if you look at the text here, they're talking about the Trinity, equal in form, which was highly debated at this time. How were these Trinitarian Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, how were they to be understood? Still trying to get a little bit of formation in your carol text. Let us rejoice and let us follow. Those things are paired. So it moves us from simply adoring the incarnation, the feeling of wonder, into this realm of action, of response. The birth of Jesus demands a response in its hearers, in those who come to it. You cannot take it in all its glory and not be moved to activity. At least we shouldn't be. The tune is anonymous, but I think you'll recognize it. It's marked from about 1420. The manuscript now lives in the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, and as I said, it's a beautiful trio, noted again for its polyphonic sort of Renaissance feel. The melody is in the tenor, so when you're listening, the melody will be in the tenor voice, and it'll have an alto and a soprano as well, and it's meant to be unaccompanied. So again, it's a sort of, it sort of shines on its own, and you'll hear it's got a nice sort of rhythm to it as it comes through. I won't try to sing it because I don't know it well enough. But again, cool. 600 years ago, they were listening to this probably similarly, if not exactly the same way, which I think is cool. Anyways, we move now to the Annunciation. This is Mary, that rose of such virtue that we just talked about, becoming even more the focus of the story of Gabriel coming to her and picking up on this Isaiah prophecy, promising to make in her a new life, a child, who will sit on the throne of his ancestor David. And he talks about Jesus as the one who will reign over Israel forever and ever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Now we're getting this idea of him being the king. This child will be holy, so holy that he will be called the Son of God. And this is, for the New Testament writers, the promise of Isaiah coming into focus. And Mary famously responds affirmatively, making herself a servant of God's will. That's the reading, the Annunciation, and then we will sing the Magnificat, which, just to be clear for us who want to be keeping track at home in our scriptures, does not come as a part of the Annunciation scene. Right? The Magnificat comes when Mary has a little bit of time to process, and she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is also, we heard about Zechariah and John, right, in today's Sunday morning services. She is the mother of John. So her cousin, the angel says, well, your cousin's also pregnant miraculously. Go talk to her about it, because this is all a lot to take in. And she does, and Elizabeth says, oh my gosh, the mother of my Lord comes to me. I'm not worthy. And then Mary finally finds in her heart this sense of joy. But also, it's not just the joy and exciting, oh, I'm pregnant, isn't this wonderful? There's a vision that seems to come into focus for her. And this is the Magnificat. And this, I would argue, is her version of the peaceable kingdom, right? The new established order of things that will come in the coming of this child. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. He has scattered the proud in their conceit, cast down the mighty from their thrones, lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. I hear her saying, what would a world look like without the hierarchies that are the cause of exploitation and oppression and diminishment of other human beings? What would that look like? That's the dream she has. That's the vision of the kingdom that she is proclaiming in this song of praise. It's Isaiah's vision, cast into more human, more societal terms. Now, the piece we're going to hear for this Magnificat is by Charles Villier Stanford. He's a late 19th and early 20th, sort of right on the cusp of the turn of the century, Irish composer who is famous within church circles, but also famous at the time for helping to establish a musical renaissance in the British Isles. You might be surprised to learn that England has not had just a straight trajectory of great choral music throughout its history. We have borrowed much of that, but there have been sort of ebbs and flows, ups and downs, particularly with all the turmoil around the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the Puritans when they came in and all these different things, sort of Oliver Cromwell. All of that made it so that it was not just a time when people have just been singing lovely music together. It's been an evolution. And so coming out of perhaps a little bit of a down trough, Stanford comes in and helps usher in a new season, a new era of British choral music particularly. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, he's eclipsed by some of his students. He was a composer, he was a teacher as well of composition and music, and some of his students included Ralph Vaughan Williams and Gustav Holst. So he gets a little bit sort of bumped down the list of people you're familiar with from that time period. So he remains most well known for his settings of church music, his mass settings, his evensong canticles, etc. This particular setting, I can't sing for you since I've got a lot of voices, but it's a strong and beautiful setting, and it gives the song of praise some real power, some heft, some might to it. And so I would think about that as how is Mary saying this song? Right? With what exuberance, with what power? It is not Mother meek and mild, right, that is speaking here. It took a lot of chutzpah, right, for her to say yes to this and to go through with it. And you can see she's ready. She's all right. Let's do this thing. So there's an energy, there's a power to those words that is beautiful, yes, but also has strength and courage laced into it. Now, this sense of strength, of courage, of intensity in the response to God's call then gets amplified in John the Baptist, right? The next lesson. That sense of energy and vigor, of excitement that comes from the promised arrival of the Messiah is picked up and amplified by John. And this also happens to be his cousin, right? John is living, we hear, that prophet life, literally embodying another one of Isaiah's prophecies that there would, like we heard this morning, be a voice calling out from the wilderness to get people ready for that coming of the promised one. And so here we have this wild man on the fringes of society calling out for repentance and foretelling Jesus' arrival, ramping up the urgency and insistency, saying, get ready! He's coming! And he's shouting it. This, I would say, is also a component of the kingdom, right? In order to bring in this peaceable kingdom, this Magnificat vision that Isaiah and Mary are talking about, there will necessarily be a disruption, perhaps even a destruction, a clearing away of all that is out of order with that vision. It's a glorious vision, I hope you can agree, but it's so far from what we know life on earth to be that a restructuring is in order. And like most restructurings, it will not be clean or neat or nice or tidy. Again, the Magnificat gestures toward this. Isaiah gestures to the glories of it. But John is putting it right in our faces and saying, we're going to get there, folks. We got some work to do. We got to clean up. And that's part of what he's all about. And not everybody likes that message. Most people, in fact, do not like that message. Some people are up for it. But those in power, those for whom the established order is quite fine, are not fans. And it will eventually cost John his head, right? Now, the hymn that we have here is one that we sang at the opening of this morning's service, On Jordan's Bank, the Baptist Cry, a solid 18th century hymn tune and text from Charles Coffin. Interestingly, it was originally written in Latin, even in the 18th century, and then translated, and it relates the story of John the Baptist, and for a long time was really kind of the only hymn in circulation that focused on John. And so as such, it was necessarily and often a part of Advent worship. The other hymn about John that we might know is, "There's a voice in the wilderness crying, da-da-da-da-da-da-da." That didn't come around until the 20th century. So we're looking at a few hundred years of this hymn. And I'm not going to lie, it's not one of my top 10. But it is important to highlight the role of John in this season. And I would say, if you're listening at home or if you're here and you fancy yourself a composer, John deserves a better hymn. And maybe a couple more. So we have a few more options to sing. It's a fine hymn. If any of you were listening to, Sing for Joy, is that before Great Sacred Music on Sunday mornings? They did two versions of this hymn. And they were working really hard to dress it up. The first one had like this big trumpet fanfare, and it was like Easter or something, and we're singing about John. And they comes in, and all of a sudden he's like, oh, this is really going to be great. And then they come in, and it goes, "On Jordan's bank the Baptist." It's like, oh, come on. It didn't quite save the hymn from itself. Then at the end, they tried to set it to a different tune. And I'm not going to remember what it was, but it was a Puer Nos. I can't remember what it was, but if you can find it, you'll find that they set the tune to another hymn, and it still didn't work. So they were trying really hard to dress this up. But because this has been sort of the only text and tune mixed together for such a long time, I think people are looking for inventive ways to engage with it. You'll see that the name of this tune is Winchester New. You might be curious to know there is in fact, or was in fact, a Winchester Old, which was circulating at the same time, and this is, "While shepherds watch their flocks by night, all seated on the ground, ba-da-da-da." So that's Winchester Old, and Winchester New, "On Jordan's bank the Baptists cry." Why they couldn't name it something else, I don't know, but new and old, that's what you have. So this, in the liturgy, concludes our section on prophecy, and brings us then to the second coming. We skip over the birth itself because we are not yet at Christmas, and we move ourselves from first Advent to second Advent. Brings us to the present day, essentially. Christ has come, Christ will come again, we say, and we live in expectation of that, watching and waiting, which are, after all, the main themes that we celebrate in Advent. The lesson we will hear to start to prepare us for that is a parable from Matthew 25. Explores this with the wise and foolish bridesmaids. The foolish bridesmaids are those who do not prepare and thus miss the coming of the bridegroom. This is Jesus' way of telling people that there is something to come, something to look forward to be ready for. Jesus is saying this, right? And it's an injunction for us to be prepared and to stay awake, to stay alert. That's why watchfulness and waiting and preparation are such important themes right now. Not to get ready for Christmas, to get ready for Christ to come again. And here we will hear what is perhaps the theme of Advent, the song of the season, Wachet auf, right? Sleepers wake. Alertness, awakeness, preparedness is picked up on in this theme. It's a 16th century German chorale, originally written by the German pastor Philipp Nicolai. He was a pastor in the 16th century in Westphalia, northwestern Germany, and it borrows heavily from this bridesmaid's parable as well as other scriptural references. Interestingly, what I found out when I was looking this up, written during an epidemic in 1597 to 1598, in which 1,300 people died in his surrounding area, and the little churchyard outside his office was burying up to 30 people a day. Sort of, given our current circumstances, lets us hear this hymn in a new way. The tune itself, called the King of Corrals, you recognize that? It's notable for its life beyond just this hymn. Nicolai, most likely the one who pulled it together, but there is some indication that he was building on a tune from the great early 16th century German artist and Meistersinger, a poet, singer, playwright, shoemaker, Hans Sachs. But in the 17th century, Bach gets a hold of it. And he took it and changed it ever so slightly, the tune, added harmonies on top of it, and put it at the close of his cantata number 140, and that's what becomes the more familiar, the more famous tune, the more famous version, the choir version that we will hear this afternoon. Interestingly, Mendelssohn then picks it up about a century later and borrows it for his own purposes. So it's a tune with a long life within German music. And it really does call you to attention, but it's more like a sunrise than a loud crash, right? It's not like someone, sort of slamming cymbals in your ears while you're oversleeping. It's more like the dawning of things. It builds and swells and then comes down and swells again. And that's the wakeness, the alertness that we are called to. It's of the whole being. Builds with real purpose and with power. And this, then, King of Corrals, leads us into the final reading. The question becomes, in our minds, okay, we're ready, we're awake, we're alert. What are we waiting for? What are we looking forward to? It's not the birth of Christ, that already happened, right? So what are we expecting? And that brings us to the end. The end of the Bible, the end of time, the end point of history, when the union between the spiritual and the earthly realities shall come as one, and the true reign of Jesus Christ over all the earth will be complete. So our last reading is from the book of Revelation. Now, if you know Revelation, you know that much of the book is given over to fantastical battles that wouldn't seem out of place in a Marvel superhero movie, right? But all of that is a highly dramatized version of what Mary and John the Baptist were talking about. The need to clear the way to change the reality so that this peaceable kingdom, this triumph of light over dark, of a world that exists in peace and harmony, that could come. A new heaven and a new earth where there won't actually be any separation between them. That's the vision. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." What a thought, right? What a hope. That is what we're waiting for. That is what we are looking forward to. And do you hear the echoes of Isaiah? Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. The echoes of Mary and John. A new heaven. First things have passed away. New heaven, new earth, new Jerusalem. And where do we look for it? Well, tradition would tell us that we look to the east. Right? That's the direction people thought to expect the coming of this king and this kingdom. Which makes a certain amount of sense. Right? Because it makes sense that the ultimate victory of light over dark would come as the sun breaking over the horizon, would it not? Scattering the darkness and bringing on of the dawn of a yet more glorious day. And with that, we are back at the beginning, are we not? In the beginning where God created light out of darkness. And here, when all darkness will be swallowed in light and life, we are where we began. With the sun rising, with light coming into being and then staying for all time. The carol, People Look East, which you heard if you were in church this morning, recites a litany of those who should be preparing for the coming of love, right? The fulfillment of life in love. The people, the land, the birds, the air, the birds of the air, the stars, the angels, all should be ready because love, the guest, the rose, the bird, the star, the Lord is on the way, it says. All of creation, then, is called to attention. The same way all of creation was called into being by that first act of God creating light. And we are swept up along with them. We'll then have a period of prayer as the circle is now complete, right? From creation to the promise of the birth to the excitement of what that return will mean, could mean. That's Advent. And then we will celebrate the encapsulation of that message with what, for my money, is one of the best hymns in the hymnal regardless of season. Lo, he comes. The text is by Charles Wesley, who along with his brother John was famous for founding Methodism, but we can forgive him that with hymn texts like this and so many others. It picks up on the Revelation reading, you'll notice in the text itself. And because we're short on time, I won't read it. But the music, if you ask me, is really what makes this memorable. Like any truly great work of art, it is the pairing of those two things. The text is paired with the tune Helmsley, which was written by others but fashioned into its current form and brought back from the Methodists and other nonconformists in England by Ralph Vaughan Williams in the 19th century. And this powerful poetry is set to these soaring lines that sort of swell and swoop like a bird riding on the wings of the wind and catching us up in it so that we too are transported in heart and mind to that glorious day when Christ the Lord returns to reign. So, that's what we have to look forward to this afternoon. A lovely service meant to encapsulate and enrich the Advent season, and I do hope you will join us and enjoy it, and that I hope in doing some explication of the service itself, it adds to your ability to enter in prayer and worship with us this afternoon. So, questions, responses. We have about, let's say, 2 minutes if you'd like to offer anything of your own. John Scott? Yes. He was at, I'm not going to remember exactly where, but he was at one of the big cathedrals over in England for a long time. Yes, Cynthia?
What does bidding prayer mean?
The bidding prayer is sort of the opening prayer. It's an extended prayer where if you read it, it sort of is bidding the people in to a time of prayer, confession, and supplication in preparation for the music that is and readings that are coming. Vince, yeah?
Will it be virtual?
Yes, we are planning to live stream this afternoon's service as well. So you should be able to find it on our website, the same place you would go for Sunday morning worship. Good question, Vince. Yes, Jamie? Thank you. Well, we can't take all the credit. That's very kind of you. It was a joy to do. We're borrowing much of this liturgy that has been pieced together by others, so we're not inventing it whole cloth, but it is a somewhat newer version of Advent lessons and carols, which has never quite found a home as anything other than the sort of poor man's cousin to Christmas lessons and carols, right? So in this way, I think what people are trying to do is use this particular liturgy itself to highlight some of the really important components of Advent that, again, get sort of swallowed up in the Christmas, the joys and the love and the wonders of Christmas. I'm not trying to negate any of those. Those are glorious, and you should come to that service too. But this one has its own merits, I think, as well. All right, well, thank you all for being with us this morning. We'll look forward to seeing you this afternoon, if you can make it, or online. And blessed Advent to you all. Thank you. Again, if you have a bulletin,